The FBI had to use helicopters to reach these families, not because they were criminals, but because outsiders literally couldn't find them. The Appalachian Mountains weren't built for visitors. These ancient peaks and valleys formed a natural fortress that kept families locked away from the outside world for generations. When early settlers first pushed into eastern Kentucky, they discovered something both beautiful and brutal: land that could feed a family, but also trap them there forever. Roads. What roads? Most of these mountain communities didn't see their first proper road until well into the 1900s. Railways took even longer to snake through the rocky terrain. Families who settled in the 1800s often picked a holler, that's mountain speak for a narrow valley, and stayed put. Moving wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. The geography itself became a prison of sorts. Steep ridges separated one family from another by miles of treacherous hiking. A trip to the nearest town might take days on horseback, assuming you could find a path that wouldn't kill you. Makes sense why these folks developed their own ways of doing everything, right? But here's where it gets interesting. This isolation created something unexpected: families that stayed put for decades, even centuries, marrying within the same tight circle of neighbors. When your dating pool consists of maybe 5 other families within walking distance, you don't have many options. The math gets pretty simple and pretty concerning. Generation after generation, the same surnames kept popping up in marriage records. Smiths married Fugates. Fugates married Combses. Combses married back into the Smith line. The family trees in these mountains looked less like trees and more like tangled vines, with branches looping back on themselves in ways that would make genealogists dizzy. Then there's the matter of survival. These weren't leisurely farming communities with access to outside resources. Families depended entirely on what they could grow, hunt, or make with their own hands. When you're focused on not starving through the winter, marrying your second cousin starts looking like a practical decision rather than a questionable one. At least you knew their family could work the land. The weird part is how this isolation preserved entire ways of life that vanished everywhere else. While the rest of America modernized, these mountain families kept speaking in dialects that sounded like they'd stepped out of the 1700s. They maintained folk remedies, storytelling traditions, and family loyalties that most of the country had forgotten. Outsiders rarely ventured into these remote areas, which meant fresh blood, literally and figuratively, almost never entered the gene pool. For generations, the same genetic material got shuffled and reshuffled like a deck of cards that never got new ones added to the mix. Well, nature has its own accounting system. When the same genes keep circulating through a small population, eventually something unusual shows up. And in one particular family that settled along Troublesome Creek in Kentucky, that something was quite literally blue. The Fugates were about to become living proof of what happens when geography becomes destiny, and isolation creates its own strange kind of family legacy. When Martin Fugate arrived near Troublesome Creek in eastern Kentucky around 1820, he probably never imagined his family would become one of the most talked about bloodlines in American history. The French immigrant carried something invisible in his blood, a recessive gene that would paint his descendants blue for the next century and a half. Martin married Elizabeth Smith, a red-headed woman from a local family. What are the odds? Elizabeth carried the exact same rare gene. When both parents have this hidden genetic quirk, their children have a 25% chance of being born with blue-tinged skin. 4 of their 7 children hit that genetic lottery. The Fugate babies weren't just slightly blue. We're talking deep indigo skin that looked almost navy in certain light. Their lips, fingernails, and skin had a striking blue cast that made neighbors stop and stare. But here's the weird part. These blue children were perfectly healthy otherwise. They ran, played, worked the farm, and lived normal lives. Some even outlived their pink-skinned relatives. Well, normal became relative pretty quickly in those Kentucky hollers. The Fugates didn't pack up and move somewhere else like most families might. Instead, they dug in deeper. Martin's blue sons married local girls. His blue daughters married local boys. Then there's where things get mathematically interesting and genetically complicated. The isolation of Troublesome Creek meant the dating pool was basically a puddle. Cousins married cousins, aunts married nephews. The Fugate family tree started looking more like a family wreath, all twisted back on itself. Each generation increased the chances of producing more blue babies, and the blue trait didn't stay put in just one family. The gene spread like gossip through the tight-knit community. Soon the Combses had blue children, then the Stacys. The Richies joined the Blue Club too. Entire family reunions looked like something out of a fantasy novel. Luna Fugate, born in 1906, was so blue that doctors thought she might die from lack of oxygen. Her grandmother reportedly said, "She's as blue as the Blue Ridge Mountains." Luna lived to be 84. Makes sense, right? Sometimes the most unusual genetic combinations produce surprisingly hardy people. The Blue families became local legends, but not always in a good way. Neighbors whispered about curses and devil's work. Some blamed bad water or strange diseases. Others just pointed and stared when the Blue Fugates came to town for supplies. The families learned to keep to themselves even more, which only made the inbreeding worse. By the 1960s, there were still Blue Fugates living in the same Kentucky valleys their ancestors had settled. Benjamin Stacy was born blue in 1975. His skin gradually turned normal as he got older, though his lips stayed purple when he got cold. But the Blue families weren't the only ones dealing with genetic mysteries and social isolation in Appalachia. Further south, another group faced even stranger challenges and much more dangerous secrets that could get them killed. The Melungeons weren't exactly your typical mountain family. They lived scattered across East Tennessee and Southwest Virginia, carrying a mix of black, white, and possibly Native American blood in their veins. But here's where things got complicated and dangerous. Back in the 1800s, America had some pretty brutal laws about race mixing. We're talking serious legal consequences for anyone caught crossing those invisible lines society had drawn. Marriage between different races? Forbidden. Kids from mixed unions? They faced a lifetime of legal limbo. The Melungeons found themselves stuck in this impossible situation, trapped between worlds that didn't want to claim them. Well, what do you do when the law basically says you can't exist? You adapt, fast. These families did something remarkable. They created their own survival network. Melungeons started marrying only other Melungeons. Cousins wed cousins. Families intertwined like mountain ivy, creating a web of relationships that kept them safe but also kept their gene pool incredibly small. Sound familiar? The same isolation that gave us blue-skinned Fugates was happening all over again, just for completely different reasons. Let's not forget the creativity involved in staying alive. Some Melungeon families developed elaborate cover stories about their heritage. Portuguese ancestry became a popular claim, exotic enough to explain their darker features, but European enough to avoid the worst discrimination. Others insisted they descended from shipwrecked sailors or lost Turkish settlers. These weren't just tall tales. They were survival strategies written in flesh and blood, and the weird part is how organized their isolation became. When legal pressure got too intense in Virginia, entire family networks would pack up and move together. The Gibsons, the Goins families, the Collins clan, they'd relocate as complete units to remote Tennessee valleys. Nobody traveled alone. Nobody married outside the group. Nobody talked to outsiders about family business. This kind of extreme isolation created something anthropologists find fascinating today. The Melungeons developed their own dialect, mixing Appalachian English with words that linguists still can't fully trace. Their storytelling traditions blended European folktales with what might be African or Native American elements. Even their cooking showed this cultural fusion, recipes that didn't quite match what neighboring white or black families were making. But the genetic consequences? Those were just as dramatic as anything happening up on Troublesome Creek. Generations of intermarriage within the same small group led to some unusual traits. 6 fingers weren't uncommon. Certain eye colors showed up repeatedly. Some families had distinctive facial features that marked them as Melungeon from miles away. The isolation also bred incredible loyalty and secrecy. Melungeon families could trace their connections back through 5 or 6 generations, knowing exactly who was related to whom and how. They had to. Their survival depended on maintaining these tight networks while keeping outsiders from understanding how their community really worked. Yet even the most isolated communities couldn't stay hidden forever. As the outside world crept closer to Appalachian valleys, scientists and curious outsiders would eventually start asking uncomfortable questions about these mysterious families and their strange genetic legacy. For nearly 2 centuries, the blue-skinned Fugates baffled everyone who met them. Doctors scratched their heads. Neighbors whispered behind closed doors. Some folks blamed witchcraft. Others pointed fingers at contaminated well water. The most religious families muttered about divine punishment or demonic influence. Nobody had a clue what was really happening. Local physicians in the 1800s tried everything they could think of. Bloodletting, herbal remedies, prayers, and folk medicines, nothing worked. The blue skin wasn't painful or deadly, just there. Permanent as a tattoo, impossible to explain. Makes sense that people got creative with their theories, right? Then came the 1960s, and everything changed. Dr. Madison Colwine III, a hematologist from the University of Kentucky, heard whispers about the blue people during his rounds in eastern Kentucky. Most doctors would have dismissed it as mountain folklore, not Colwine. He drove deep into troublesome Creek territory, notebook in hand, determined to solve a medical mystery that had stumped generations. What he discovered was methemoglobinemia, a rare blood disorder caused by a missing enzyme. The technical name doesn't matter much, but here's what does: when you inherit defective genes from both parents, your blood can't carry oxygen properly. Instead of bright red blood, you get chocolate brown blood, and chocolate brown blood makes your skin look blue through the surface. The kicker? This condition only shows up when both parents carry the recessive gene. In most places, the odds of finding someone else with that same rare gene are astronomical. But in isolated Appalachian communities where cousin marriages were common practice, those odds skyrocketed. Dr. Colwine found that a simple treatment worked wonders. Methylene blue injections turned the blue-skinned fugates pink within minutes. The effect was temporary, but it proved his theory correct. Science had finally caught up with Appalachian mystery. Let's not forget the social cost of being different in small mountain communities. The fugates and other unusual families faced decades of pointing, staring, and cruel jokes. Children got teased mercilessly at school. Adults found it harder to find work or acceptance in neighboring towns. Some families became even more isolated, retreating deeper into their hollers to avoid judgment. But here's the surprising twist: many of these genetically compromised mountain families lived remarkably long lives. Blue fugates regularly reached their 80s and 90s, some lived past 100. Their unusual blood condition didn't seem to shorten their lifespan much, if at all. Oral storytelling became the primary way these families preserved their histories. Written records were scarce in remote mountain areas, so stories passed from grandmother to granddaughter, father to son. These tales grew more colorful with each telling, mixing fact with legend until the truth became nearly impossible to separate from fiction. The Melungeons faced similar scientific scrutiny and social prejudice. Their mixed ancestry made them targets of both curiosity and discrimination. Well into the 20th century, researchers poked and prodded these families, trying to solve the puzzle of their origins. Today's world looks very different from those isolated mountain communities. Modern transportation, education, and marriage patterns have transformed Appalachian life in ways the original settlers never could have imagined. Those winding mountain roads that once kept families isolated for centuries, they're mostly paved now. What used to take a full day's horseback ride through muddy hollers can be covered in 30 minutes by car. The blue fugates and their neighbors aren't cut off from the world anymore. Modern highways snaked through eastern Kentucky starting in the 1960s. Television signals bounced off those same ridges that had trapped families for generations. Young people could suddenly see beyond troublesome creek. College became possible. Jobs in distant cities started calling their names. Well, here's the thing about genetic isolation: it needs isolation to survive. When roads opened up those remote valleys, something fascinating happened. People started marrying strangers. The blue skin trait that had persisted for nearly 150 years began disappearing within just 2 generations. Benjamin Benji Stacy was probably the last truly blue baby born to the fugate line, arriving in 1975. His skin was so blue that doctors rushed him to a specialist in Lexington, fearing heart problems. But as Benji grew older and his blood got more oxygen, that distinctive blue faded to a slight purple tinge around his lips and fingernails. Today, you'd never know he carried those famous genes. Then there's the Melungeon mystery that puzzled historians for decades. DNA testing finally arrived in Appalachia around the 1990s, and the results shocked everyone. Those families hiding their mixed heritage, turns out they were mostly of European and African descent, with very little Native American blood despite generations of claims about Cherokee grandmothers. Makes sense why they protected those stories, right? Claiming Native ancestry felt safer than admitting African roots in a region where racial mixing could get you killed. But here's where it gets interesting. Instead of destroying their identity, modern science actually strengthened it. Melungeon descendants now hold massive family reunions every summer, celebrating their unique heritage openly. They've got websites, genealogy groups, and even DNA projects tracking their ancestry across continents. The old clan surnames still dominate phone books throughout eastern Kentucky. Fugits, Combses, Stacys, and Richies never really left their ancestral hollers. They just stopped marrying each other exclusively. Family reunions can still draw hundreds of relatives to the same creek bottoms where their great-great-grandparents first settled. And the weird part is how proud they've become of their unusual history. What once brought shame and whispers now attracts tourists and documentary crews. The Blue Fugits have been featured in medical journals, history books, and countless television specials. Local museums display old photographs showing blue-tinged children standing barefoot outside log cabins. Gift shops sell postcards about Kentucky's blue people. The very thing that made these families outcasts has become their claim to fame. Some descendants still carry the recessive gene, hidden in their DNA like a sleeping secret. Every once in a while, two carriers might meet and marry, not knowing they both hold the key to that distinctive blue skin. Those isolated mountain families changed America's understanding of genetics, identity, and survival. Their legacy lives on in every holler, every family story, and every scientific breakthrough that followed their unusual journey through Appalachian history.